The Wednesday Wars, April. The next week, Mrs. Sidman read the names of the 7 members of the Camillo Junior High School varsity cross-country team during the morning announcements. "We are very glad to have these 7 students represent our school," said Mrs. Sidman, "most especially Holling Hoodhood, who will represent the 7th grade. Holling came in with the fastest time during tryouts, almost a minute faster than any of the 8th graders on the team. We wish you all luck, boys." This was frightening. It was the kind of stuff that makes you hope that you are never alone in the locker room with the other guys on your team. And there wasn't much help from anyone in Mrs. Baker's class. "I wonder why Holling had the fastest time," said Danny after the announcements, a whole lot louder than he had to. "Could it be because he was running away from 2 rats who were trying to eat him?" "That might have had a little to do with it," I said. "A little," said Danny. "A little," said Marilee. "A little," said Mai Tai. "A very little," I said. And everyone in class ripped out a piece of paper from their notebooks, scrunched it up, and threw it at me, which was unfair, since you can't stop 22 pieces of scrunched up paper at the same time. You pretty much know from what I just told you that Mrs. Baker wasn't in the room. She had been called down to the office for a phone call before the morning announcements, and she'd had Mr. Vendlary to stay with us while she was gone, which was why balls of scrunched up paper surrounded my desk by the time Mrs. Baker came back. And since generally the person who is surrounded by balls of scrunched up paper will be the person blamed for all the balls of scrunched up paper, I figured I would be the one who would have to pick them all up. That's how it is in the world, but not this time. Because the phone call in the office was from the United States Army. The Viet Cong had abandoned Khe Sanh, and 20,000 American troops were marching to relieve the Marines, and find missing American soldiers, like Lieutenant Baker. "It will be called," Mrs. Baker told us, "Operation Pegasus. Now someone tell me the meaning of the classical allusion." She never did say anything about all the balls of scrunched up paper around my desk. You may have noticed, too, that it was Mrs. Sidman who read the morning announcements over the PA instead of Mr. Goreshi. That was because Mr. Goreshi was gone. Mrs. Baker had told us that he had received administrative reassignment, but that only meant that he was gone. And Mrs. Sidman was our new principal. Really, I suppose the school board figured that if Mrs. Sidman could pick up 2 huge rats by the scruff of their necks and carry them through the halls, she could certainly handle middle schoolers, which was probably true. No one saw Mr. Goreshi leave, still looking for a small country to be a dictator of, but everyone saw Mrs. Sidman on the first day she was principal. She stood in the main lobby and watched us come in. She already knew most of our names and must have said good morning 300 times. She stood straight with her arms folded across her chest, which, as any teacher coach will tell you, isn't good for teachers, but probably isn't bad for principals. I heard that she even stared down Doug Sweetek's brother. While Mrs. Sidman was starting up her new job at Camillo Junior High, President Lyndon B. Johnson was giving up his old one at the White House. Walter Cronkite carried the announcement to the last day of March. President Johnson said that he did not want to be distracted by partisan politics, with America's sons in the fields far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home. He had decided that he would not run for the presidency again. His whole face seemed to sag down as he said this. "He doesn't want to be humiliated," said my sister at the first commercial that night. "He knows he can't win against Bobby Kennedy. He knows he can't win against Richard Nixon," said my father, "not with the whole war on his back. Either way, he's getting out because he doesn't want to lose, not because he cares about America's future." My father sighed a loud sigh. Is that how all flower children make their judgments, so quick and easy?" "When they're quick and easy to make," said my little sister. Only the end of the commercial stopped what could have gotten a whole lot louder. I seemed to see President Johnson's sagging face throughout the rest of the news. Banquo's face probably looked a whole lot like that before Macbeth had killed him, when he suddenly realized that everything he had hoped for was crashing down. And then on top of that, we found out that after the CBS Evening News, that President Johnson wasn't the only one giving up his job. "Kowalski's finished too," said my father. We all looked at him. "What do you mean?" said my mother. "Finished," said my father. "Done. Over. Washed up. Kaput. I told you he couldn't play for keeps. They'll announce it in a couple of weeks or so. No more Kowalski and Associates. We'll be the only architectural firm in town that matters." He looked at me. "I told you we'd be going places if we got the junior high job, didn't I?" I nodded. He had told me. "What about the Kowalskis?" I asked. My father shrugged. "Architecture's a blood sport," he said. So at lunch recess the next day, Marilee and I spent a lot of time not saying anything, until Marilee said it for us. I might be moving, she said. I looked at her. I'll probably be moving. Where? I said. To my grandmother's house in Kingston. I nodded. Another minute or so of not saying anything went by. I knew I should say something. I guess after reading all that Shakespeare, I should know what to say, but I didn't have a single word. So Marilee said it for us again. Toads, beetles, bats, she said, and that was exactly right. Marilee didn't know how long she had left, maybe just 2 or 3 weeks, so we decided to pretend that it was forever and we didn't talk about it, and we tried not to think about it. But there were those moments when one of us would look at the other and we knew what we were thinking, even when we wouldn't say it. Probably sort of how it was between Romeo and Juliet. It helped to run hard, so hard that you can't think about much of anything else because your arteries are all opened out as far as they can be, looking for some oxygen, any oxygen, because you can't pull enough air into your lungs, and there's this coach who has invented an entirely new vocabulary to wrap around the word faster, a vocabulary that even Caliban would have blushed at. We ran for more miles a day than most commuters drive. We ran through neighborhoods that I don't think are even in Nassau County. We ran past other junior high schools and got jeered at by baseball players who warmed up with a couple of sprints and then shagged balls the rest of the afternoon. We ran past the red tulips in front of St. Adalbert's and the white lilacs in front of the Temple Bethel. We ran past Goldman's Best Bakery and smelled the latest batch of cream puffs, sending their scent through the open windows. One day we ran all the way to Jones Beach, and if Mrs. Sidman hadn't sent a bus after us, I think we would have collapsed on the boardwalk and died. But I was getting faster, really, even though I stayed at the back of the pack of the 8th graders. Let me tell you, when you're in the 7th grade, it isn't healthy to run at the front of a pack of 8th graders. I did it once, and they pulled my shorts down to my ankles in mid-stride. You don't let something like that happen twice. You stay at the back of the pack, and you learn the telltale signs of someone ahead of you who is about to spit off to the side. Danny understood this too, since he ran behind the 8th graders on the junior varsity team. And they were angry 8th graders. Angry 8th graders with plenty of spit. Mrs. Baker did not understand why I was running behind anyone. She decided to give me a month off Shakespeare to coach me, since developing the body as well as the mind, she said, was a humane and educational activity. Every Wednesday she timed a 3-mile run, and I was dropping a couple of minutes with each one. This didn't include the time I made when Sycorax and Caliban were chasing me, when I think I might have beaten Jesse Owens. My lean was better, Mrs. Baker said, and my arms a lot looser, but she still wanted to work on my breathing. And so after the 3 miles, we did wind sprints until I almost threw up, which makes you want to get your breathing better in a hurry. Mrs. Baker didn't care that I had regular practice on Wednesday afternoons after school with Coach Quattrini. If you want to get better, you run, she said. You can't possibly run too much, which I do not think is true, but probably is some sort of teacher strategy. Marilee didn't understand why I was running at all, since it meant I wasn't working on the California Gold Rush and You project, and she'd already written all the notes for our report and started on the contour map. Don't think a rose and a Coke are going to get you out of this, she said, which I already knew. Remember, I'm not a jerk like Romeo. And that was why one afternoon I was in Marilee's kitchen, working on making the California Gold Rush relevant to you, when Mr. Kowalski came home and told us what he had heard on the car radio, that Martin Luther King Jr., who was in Memphis helping striking sanitation workers, had been shot and killed. He died, Mr. Kowalski said, just after he had asked a friend to play Precious Lord, Take My Hand. Marilee took my hand and we went into the living room where Walter Cronkite was just finishing the news. He told us that it was all horribly true. I thought he was shaking. Nothing will ever be the same, said Mr. Kowalski. Marilee squeezed my hand hard. That night my sister would not come down to supper, and my father did not call her down. He sat with a face as grim as President Johnson's. Every so often he would look up the stairs to my sister's room, then back down to his lima beans. How could this happen, he said. The next day there were riots in Chicago, in Savannah, in Washington, in Toledo, in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, and in New York. We were coming apart, my father said. And on Tuesday, while everyone at Camillo Junior High watched on a television in the gym, my father stayed home from Hood and Associates to watch on our television 2 Georgia mules draw the old green farm wagon that carried the body of Martin Luther King Jr. down through the streets of Atlanta. He didn't say a thing at supper, neither did my sister. Just before I went to bed that night, I reminded my father that the next day was opening day at Yankee Stadium. You probably remember how we got the tickets, and he had promised to drive me there to meet Danny and his father, and Doug and his father. and to write a note to get me out of Coach Quattrini's cross-country practice for that day, and to let me leave before school ended. Isn't there enough happening in the world that you shouldn't have to go in the city for a baseball game, he said. It's opening day, I said. He shook his head. He never did write the note, so I wrote it myself and I got him to sign it in the morning. I told him that he needed to pick me up at 12 noon sharp since the game began at 2. Sure, he said, which were the same words that Coach Quattrini used when I showed him the note. You expect me to believe that your father wrote this, he said. I wrote the note. He signed it, I said. Did he read it before he signed it? No, you pied ninny, you blind mole, I wanted to say. He didn't read it. He just signs whatever I ask him to sign, like blank checks with lots of numbers to the left of the decimal point. Yes, I said. Coach Quattrini scrunched the paper in a ball and threw it at me. I won't go easy on you at the next practice, he said, as if this was something I hadn't already counted on. Mrs. Baker figured that since I was leaving early, I should do the whole day's work in the morning. When I pointed out that neither Danny nor Doug was even in this class, and they were probably taking the whole day off, and maybe they were sitting in Yankee Stadium already, watching batting practice with Horace Clark and Joe Pepitone, hitting them out a mile, Mrs. Baker pointed out that run-on sentences were improper, and I would do well to get started on the non-restrictive clauses worksheet, which I did since the prospect of opening day at Yankee Stadium made even non-restrictive clauses bearable. And it probably helped that Danny and Doug would have to do all the work the next day anyway. By the time noon came, my hands were blue with the fresh ditto ink, but I had finished every non-restrictive clause exercise, and done the reading comprehension, and even done more to make the California Gold Rush relevant to you by pointing out the perils of the love of money in a brilliantly worded argument for Mr. Petrelli, which I handed Mrs. Baker while everyone went out to lunch recess. Why don't you take this down to his room, she said. By that time your father will be here. So I did, and Mr. Petrelli made me stand there by his desk as he read it over, as he pointed out the powerful use of non-restrictive clauses, as he advised against the use of cliches, and as he identified more than one historical inaccuracy, and as I squirmed imagining my father standing in his three-piece suit by Mrs. Baker's desk, large and important, the Chamber of Commerce businessman of 1967, and probably 1968 too. When Mr. Petrelli finished, I hurried back to Mrs. Baker's room, since I wasn't sure that I wanted my father to be standing there, being large and important. But I didn't need to hurry, since when I got to the room, my father wasn't standing by Mrs. Baker's desk. We both looked up at the clock, 12:11. 11 lousy minutes after 12, and he wasn't here yet. I ran down to the main administrative office and called Hoodhood and Associates. I'm sorry, said his secretary. Mr. Hoodhood has been out of the site and the new junior high school all day and isn't expected back until 2:30. He has a baseball game at 2 o'clock, I said. No, he has an important meeting with the Chamber of Commerce C scheduled for 4:30. He wouldn't miss a Chamber of Commerce meeting for a baseball game. She was right, he wouldn't. I hung up the phone and went back to the classroom. Mrs. Baker was reading in her Shakespeare book when I came back. Oh, she said when she saw me. She looked up at the clock. Oh, she said again. Merrill Lee came back into the room. She stood at the door when she saw me. Aren't you? And then she stopped, because apparently I wasn't. One by one, everyone came back from lunch recess. One by one, they looked at me and knew what had happened. And what was there to say? I sat down at my desk, as humiliated as President Johnson would have been if he had lost to Bobby Kennedy. My heart beat against my chest. I was surprised that no one else could hear it. I suppose there may have been a more miserable hour sometime in my life, but I couldn't think of what it might have been. Until 1:55, when everyone had left for Temple Bethel or St. Adalbert's, and Mrs. Baker said, Mr. Hoodhood, I think I could get you there for some of the game. The sweetest words e'er spoken. I almost cried. I took the 2 tickets out of my shirt pocket and held them up. Have you ever been to a Yankee game, Mrs. Baker? Never intentionally, she said. Call your mother and see if it's all right. Which I did, except she wasn't home. So I called my sister at high school. You're calling me at school for that? Why should I care what time you'll be back, she said, which I figured was good enough. And that was how Mrs. Baker and I found ourselves on the Long Island Expressway, driving toward New York City, me looking at my watch every 3 minutes or so, and Mrs. Baker moving along at a steady 45 miles per hour in a 60-mile-per-hour zone. You can go up to 65 without getting a ticket, I pointed out. I tend to not want to see how far I can break the law before I'm caught. You drove a lot faster than this to the hospital. Much faster, but I was going to the hospital. Today I'm driving to a baseball game. On opening day, it's just as important, I said. And I just saw you roll your eyes. "I never roll my eyes," said Mrs. Baker, "but if I did roll my eyes, that would have been an appropriate time to do so." The whole way, she never passed 45. She fussed at the Whitestone Bridge toll to get the right changed, and she fussed at the parking lot because she wanted to find a space with no cars on either side, which there weren't any of within 3 miles, and that was about how far away we parked. And we didn't run to Yankee Stadium in 7-minute miles, let me tell you. So it was the bottom of the 3rd inning by the time that Mrs. Baker and I reached our box seats, which were on the first baseline, right next to the Yankee dugout. You could make out every pinstripe on every uniform. We were that close. Mr. Hupfer got up and let me sit in front with Danny and Doug, and he sat behind us with Mrs. Baker and Mr. Sweetek. And Danny never asked about Mrs. Baker being there, even though I knew he wanted to. But I didn't care anymore because it was April and it was opening day at Yankee Stadium, and the California Angels were out in the field and the Yankees were up at bat. The game was everything it was supposed to be. Horace Clarke turned a double play off his heel, and Joe Pepitone caught a pop fly over his shoulder. Frank Fernandez had hit only the home run in the 2nd inning, so we'd missed it, which was a big deal since it won the game. And Mel Stottlemyre threw a 4-bit shutout. Mickey Mantle had 2 singles, so Danny and I couldn't boo him like we wanted to. And when Horace Clarke came out of the dugout for the 7th inning stretch, he tossed 3 balls to us, and we almost had one off a Mickey Mantle foul ball, except it hit the bar along the box seats and skipped over us. And Mr. Hupfer and Mr. Sweetek brought us all, even Mrs. Baker, hot dogs with sauerkraut and more hot dogs with sauerkraut, and Cokes in bottles with all the ice still frozen to them, and pretzels as big as both your hands together, and then another hot dog with sauerkraut for each of us. And we shouted and hollered when the bum ump made a lousy call on Joe Pepitone that made him strike out. And everybody, even Mrs. Baker, stood and cheered when Mel Stottlemyre retired 10 batters in a row. It was just swell. But what happened afterward, that was just swell too. Joe Pepitone and Horace Clarke yelled up to our box at the end of the game. "Hey, Danny, hauling Doug," they called. Just like that. "Hey, Danny, hauling Doug." There wasn't a kid within earshot that didn't wish they were us. "Hey," we called back. "You want to come down on the field?" asked Horace Clarke, which we didn't need to answer because we were already climbing over the railing. That was when Joe Pepitone saw Mrs. Baker. "You're that dame that got us to come out to that school last December," he said. Let me tell you, I wasn't sure Mrs. Baker had ever been called that dame before, and I was sure she wasn't all that happy about it now. Mrs. Baker crossed her arms over her chest, even though I had coached her against that. "Yes," she said, "though it was my brother-in-law who contacted you." She said it in this frozen voice that would have quieted any 7th grade class in half a second. But Joe Pepitone didn't notice. He took a step closer. "Aren't you that dame that ran in Melbourne? The women's 4x100. You anchored, right?" I was really sure that Mrs. Baker had never been called that dame twice in 2 sentences that came one after the other. "Yes," she said. "I saw that race. You were in 5th place when you got the baton, and you almost made it all up the last 100. You came in something like 3/10 of a second behind." 2/10, said Mrs. Baker. "Hey, Horace," said Joe Pepitone, "do you know who this is? Get Houck over here and see if he remembers that dame we saw anchor the 4x100 relay in Melbourne, and get Cox over here, too." And that was why when the photographers came to take pictures after the game, they found most of the Yankees around the dame with the legs that almost made up 5 places in the Melbourne Olympic Games in just 100 meters. And after she ran the race with them again 5 times over, she asked the Yankees to show us around the stadium, and they did. Really. Joe and Horace took us up into the bleachers and to the sky-high seats, and then down beneath to the locker rooms, which Mrs. Baker did not go in, and around to the offices, and then through the dugout and back onto the field. The people who were still up in the stands saw me and Danny pitch to Joe Pepitone, with Jake Gibbs catching, and I don't think Mrs. Baker rolled her eyes once. And afterward, I ran around all the bases from home to first to second to third and back to home. And then I ran to the outfield and I sprinted from right to left and then back again. And all the while, the green grass and yellow diamond dust were in my nose, and the sun lowering over Yankee Stadium shone down on me, hauling Hood, playing center field for the New York Yankees, and waiting for the crack of the bat. When you have the chance to run the outfield of Yankee Stadium and you're not exactly sure if you'll ever have another chance, you have to take things as they come. I ran back to pitch my last pitches. The sun was getting low by the time Joe Pepitone had smacked them out, and Mrs. Baker stood at home plate, surveying the place like she was considered buying it. "What is all that scaffolding up there for?" she asked. Maybe she was considering buying it. Repairs, said Joe. Lots of places in the stadium need repairs. They're waiting on the boss finding an architect. An architect, said Mrs. Baker. Someone classical, the boss says. Real classical. I'd like to meet him, said Mrs. Baker. If you can hit my fastball, said Mel Stradelmeyer, I'll take you up to meet him. Mrs. Baker looked at me and rolled her eyes. Get me a bat, Mr. Hoodhood, she said. It turned out that Mr. Hupford drove me and Danny home that night. Mrs. Baker stayed to meet the boss. Mrs. Baker's picture was in the Hometown Chronicle 2 days later, standing next to Danny and Doug and me, and all of us surrounded by smiling Yankee players. I wore Joe Pepitoni's jacket to school, and Danny wore his hat, and Doug wore Horace Clark's hat. 3 sixth graders asked for my autograph on a baseball, which I gave them. Coach Quattrini, however, did not ask for an autograph. He kept his promise, and the next cross-country practice was about as hard as 2 practices put together. And since he believed in democracy, he said, he figured that everyone should have the same cross-country practice, and so all 7 of the varsity runners ran like Brutus and Cassius were after them with long and pointy knives. The 8th graders loved me after that. They threw all of my clothes in the showers, and I walked home leaving puddles at every step. So when spring break finally came, it dropped as a gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. Spring break. Were there ever 2 words put together that made a more beautiful sound? Spring break. Let me tell you, the days were warm and green. Danny, Mai Tai, Marilee, and I met at Woolworth's in the afternoons. We ordered Cokes and hamburgers for as long as our allowances held out. Spring break. The high school was out too, and so my sister was always in a happy, happy mood. She had a new friend named Chit. That really was his name. And he drove a yellow VW Bug with bright pink and orange flower decals. He was mostly legs and arms and hair, and he came over every afternoon and would go down in the basement with my sister, and they would listen to her transistor radio and then come upstairs singing about yellow submarines very loudly and laughing as like it was the funniest thing in the world. Afterward, Chit would fold himself into his yellow Bug, and my sister would go driving around with him. Spring break, warm and green days. You know they aren't going to last, but when you start in on them, they're like a week of the summer plunked down as a gift in the middle of junior high school. They mean the smell of dust and grass on a baseball diamond, the first fresh sea breezes that come all the way in from Long Island, all of the maples decked out in green gold leaves. They mean checking the tennis rackets to see if winter has warped them while they hung in the garage, and watching the first rabbit running across the lawn, and neighbors putting the first free kitten signs up on their stoops. That's spring break. You come back to school thinking that it's no longer just the end of winter. It's almost the beginning of summer, and you figure that you can hang on until the end of June, because the warm breezes are coming in the windows like quiet happiness. Coach Quattrini had made us swear on the lives of our firstborn children that we would run hard during spring break. He promised he would find out if we missed one day, just one day, and that we would pay dearly. So when we got back to school, he began the first practice with this announcement. Every runner on the varsity team was going to have to better my tryout time with the Rats by 35 seconds, no exceptions, and no rats to help. Let me tell you, the 8th graders were not happy. Once we got started on our run, there was a whole lot of spitting to the side, timed with the wind, which I had to keep watch for. And I kept well to the back of the pack since we ran through the neighborhoods where there were kids from school who knew me, and I didn't want to find myself in front of their houses with my shorts pulled down to my ankles. I was glad that Doug Sweetek's brother wasn't a varsity runner. Who knew what would happen then? It was then when we were back from the run that first day and standing around the gym doors, trying not to die, that Coach Quattrini gave his second announcement. There was going to be a Long Island Junior High School cross-country meet this spring, just to work up excitement for the fall season. It's this Saturday, so you're all going to have to get up early and miss your cartoons, he said. I feel really badly about that. So badly I could cry. Boo-hoo. Be here by 7. Bus leaves at 7:01. We run at Salisbury Park, 3 miles at race pace. Winner gets a $100 savings bond. Not that I expect any of you ladies to win. Toads, beetles, bats. That night at supper I mentioned the race. That will be nice, said my mother. Just swell, I said. Who's the coach, said my father. Coach Quattrini, I said. My father considered this for a moment. What's his first name? I shook my head. Everyone just calls him Coach Quattrini. My father shrugged and went back to eating. How far do you have to run, said my sister. I told her. You'll die, she said. I won't die. You'll get run over and crushed. It's almost happened before, I said, with the bus. She smirked at me. Hollinghood, the local town hero. Do you want a parade? How long is it until you go to college, I said. She smirked again. Not soon enough. She's not going to college, said my father. Silence, since that is one of those lines that gets everyone's attention. What? Said my sister. You're not going to college, said my father again. You've got a good job and you're not going anywhere. A long pause. Did you know that Roy White is batting .429, I said. I am going to Columbia University, said my sister. My father pressed his fork onto his plate and crushed a lima bean. Columbia, he said. Columbia. Let me think a moment. Isn't that the school that's on strike to protest the war, so there aren't any classes? It's the school where students are striking against the war and against racism. The whole world is going crazy, my father said, and no place is crazier than college. You'll stay at your job and be safe. Safe from what? Thinking? You're staying home, said my father. My sister focused on her meatloaf. By the way, Roy White really was hitting .429, which was .205 points over his last season's average, which seems to me to be important enough to talk about at supper. They were all asleep when I left for the cross-country meet on Saturday morning. Actually, I was almost asleep too when I left for the cross-country meet on Saturday morning. I think I got to Camilla Junior High only by instinct. It was cold and a little foggy, the kind of foggy that goes all through you so that everything feels wet and the cold starts to seep under your skin, and all you can think about is the warm bed that you left to do this to yourself, and you're wishing you think you had on your thermal underwear, and you're wondering why anyone would want to do this to themselves, and you see Coach Cotrini standing by the bus and shouting at everyone he can see, and you wonder even more why anyone would want to do this to themselves. Neither the fog nor the cold lifted when we got to Salisbury Park. The grass was long and wet, and the fog dripped down from the still fresh green leaves on all the trees. You could see your breath. You could especially see Coach Cotrini's breath, because he was using it a lot, telling us where to leave our stuff, where to wait, where to stop waiting, where to loosen up, where to line up. I guess that was how he stayed warm. There were something like 20 Long Island junior high schools here, and some of them even had uniforms. Most of us just had the numbers the coaches gave us pinned to our shirts. My number was 113, which is not particularly a lucky number. Danny Hupfer's was 25, which, as you know, is Joe Pepitoni's number. I asked him to change with me. Would you change with me if I had 113 and you had 25, he said. In a second, I said. Liar, he said. But when the JV boys' race started, I cheered him on anyway, standing on the sidelines between Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer and a whole bunch of little Hupfers, and Mr. Kowalski and Merrill Lee, who had come out to watch us run on an early Saturday morning. That's Merrill Lee for you. It wasn't easy to pick Danny out when they started, since there were about 300 runners on the line, and most of them had on white t-shirts. But after they left and headed into the deep woods of Salisbury Park and the thudding of 600 feet faded, we all ran to where the trail comes out for a bend and waited for him to pass. He ran through in a clump of runners mostly bigger than him, 8th graders. Keep your arms loose, I hollered. Okay, Coach, he called, heading back into the woods. And don't talk, I yelled after him. He probably didn't hear me. We ran to the next bend. When he came past, he was out in the front of the clump and running well. He shook his loose arms at me. Go, Danny, yelled Merrill Lee. Faster, you dang slug, I yelled. And he obeyed. He was sprinting when we saw his back disappear. Then we rushed back to the starting line, and we all screamed like crazy when he ran past at the top 10 and set off for the woods again, the second lap. There were 3 more after that. We were all ran over to the field to catch him whenever he came in sight. Me, all the Hupfers, and Mr. Kowalski and Merrill Lee. On the 4th lap, he came across the starting line first. We went berserk. Even Coach Cotrini went berserk, jumping up and down on the sidelines, just like one of the little Hopfers. When Danny disappeared into the woods, followed by the clump of 8th grade runners pretty far behind him, we ran back to the first bend for the 5th time and waited for the sight of Danny. But it was the clump of 8th grade runners that came out first, and then a whole line of other runners, all red and sweating in the cold, foggy air. Did we miss him? Asked Merrill Lee. But we hadn't. Way more than half of the runners had gone by before we saw Danny limping past the first bend. Both of his knees were bloody. He did not look at us. Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer had their hands over their mouths. And all the little Hupfers asked, "What happened to Danny's knees?" "I guess he must have tripped," said Mrs. Hupfer. She didn't know what might happen if a clump of 8th graders caught a 7th grader in the lead. We ran to the next 2 bends and waited. Danny was falling further and further behind. When he finally crossed the finish line, he wasn't last, but almost. His parents were waiting right there. His father took one arm and his mother the other. Merrill Lee and I stood back, and we could see that Danny was almost crying. and probably not just because his knees were hurting. He didn't look at us when Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer took him back to the car, followed by the pack of little Hupfers. Some of them were crying. Are Danny's knees going to get better? I guess cross country is also a blood sport. The varsity race was next, and I lined up behind the 8th graders, way behind the 8th graders. Get up to the line, hollered Coach Quattrini. I moved up about a half an inch, and probably that was why among the 140 runners waiting at the starting line, Mr. Hupfer was able to find me so easily. I have a message for you, he said, from Danny. I'm not sure you'll understand it. I'll try, I said. He said, beat the pied ninnies. Do you know what he means? I nodded. Then here's a message from me, he said. He leaned closer. Run them into the ground. But it's hard to run 139 runners into the ground, especially when the gun goes off and the thunder of all those feet takes over from the thunder in your heart. For a minute, I thought that my sister was right. I was going to get run over and crushed, so I drifted off to the side and sprinted to move ahead before the trail narrowed. By the time I reached the first bend out of the trees, I was just behind the clump of 8th graders from Camillo Junior High. By the time I hit the second bend, we'd passed most of the other runners. By the time we reached the starting line again, the 7 of us were out front. Actually, the 6 of them were out front, and I was running behind them. And at the starting line, this is what I saw. Mr. and Mrs. Hupfer and all the little Hupfers were behind Danny, who had not gone home but was standing there on his bloody knees and hollering as loudly as he could and waving his white shirt high up in the air. Coach Quattrini was going berserk again and seemed to be trying to levitate himself off the ground. Marilee was standing quietly, Mr. Kowalski behind her, and she held up a dried rose with a ribbon as I went by. And Mrs. Baker was standing next to her wearing her white sneakers. So we ran again into the deep woods of Salisbury Park, the damp smell of pine thick in the air. It was as if we were running alone, the 7 varsity runners of Camillo Junior High. When I looked back over my shoulder, I could see only a few runners behind us, and by the time we were on the 3rd lap, we were starting to pass runners still on their 2nd. The fog had lifted, the day had warmed, and at times I could almost close my eyes and let my feet move along the still dampened grass. And then I would find that I had come up right behind the pack of 8th graders, and they were looking back at me, and I slowed down. When we reached the starting line to begin the last lap, Coach Quattrini looked at me like he was having some sort of a fit. I'm not sure that he knew what he was hollering or if it was even English. Let me tell you, whatever it wasn't Shakespeare. All the little Hupfers were jumping up and down too, and Danny was still waving his shirt, and Marilee waving her rose, which was losing its petals. And Mrs. Baker was screaming, really. We headed into the deep woods for the last time. In the cool shade of the trees, I came up close behind the 8th grade pack, and on the first bend coming out, Mrs. Baker was waiting alone. Holling, she called. I looked at her. Pass those boys, she said, and that was all it took. I glided as we went into the woods again and stayed close while the trail narrowed and skittered through some thick underbrush. When it widened through a stand of old pines, the 8th graders looked behind and saw me, and they strung out to cover the whole path. So I went out around them, off the trail and through the pines, the needles thick and soft beneath my feet, the dead branches sharp and brittle against my face. And when I hit the trail again, I was ahead of them. And we were all sprinting, but they were sprinting on a cross-country trail in Salisbury Park. And I was sprinting through the cool grass of the outfield in Yankee Stadium, running down a ball that Joe Pepitone had just had hit right. And I was covering the ground so fast that my feet were hardly touching. And Ralph Houck was shaking his head. This kid's good, he was saying. And then everyone in Yankee Stadium was on their feet, and they were screaming and screaming because now the California Angels were trying to get to a ball I had just hit to deep left. And I was rounding first, and then second, and then third, and Danny Hupfer was waving me home with his shirt. And when I got there, the cheering erupted so loudly that I could hardly hear Mrs. Baker when she picked me up and told me to keep walking, and I could hardly hold the thorny stem that Marilee handed me. But I sure could feel it when she leaned close to my face and, well, I don't have to tell you everything.